Appreciate everyone's presence tonight. Hope you had a good, profitable day. Appreciate all the kindness and hospitality that you have extended to me. But you have got to quit feeding me so much. If you would turn in your Bibles to 1 Peter chapter 2, we're going to be spending the bulk of our time in parts of chapter 2 and in chapter 3. And we've noted in the course of this study that as Peter describes us as the temple of God, the household of God, and a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, that our task, he says in verse 9, is to proclaim the excellencies of him who called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. And so we are, as God's house, as God's priest, proclaiming his excellencies. And, you know, we might sort of think, well, that's what's he going to do? He's going to talk about worship or something along those lines. But that's actually not where Peter goes with this. As Clint read just a moment ago, that finds expression as we keep our behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander us as evildoers, they may, because of our good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. And then he sort of unpacks that idea in various situations where we interact with the world. And so this is the temple of God, proclaiming the excellencies of God in the world. And that is our role. And he starts out in verses 13 through 17. He says, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Act as free men, and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bondslaves of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king." And so he tells us that we need to, as we interact with governing authorities, that we need to submit ourselves to every human institution. Now, Peter understood, and as we should, that there are limits to that submission. Peter and John, in Acts chapter 4, in verse 19, when faced with the council and the order to cease and desist preaching Jesus, say, "Whether it is right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than to God, you be the judge." And they double down on that later in chapter 5 when they are again told to quit preaching Jesus, and they say, "We can't. We can't let you and your rule overrule God. We have to obey God and not men." And so we need to understand that God's law is the final standard. And we need to be prepared to obey God regardless of the consequences. And so, you know, there may come a time, there may be a situation, there may be a circumstance where we lose our liberty to do what God says. There will never come a time when we lose our freedom to do what God says. Those are not the same thing. There's a powerful illustration of the difference between liberty and freedom in some of the records about what went on in the concentration camps during World War II. And the author's name has escaped me at this particular moment. But he talks about the fact that the guards had all kinds of liberty, but they had sacrificed their freedom for their privileges. But then he looks at the prisoners who had held on to their freedom, because even in circumstances where all their liberties had been taken away, he said he saw starving men give their last piece of bread away to feed somebody else. And so in the circumstances they found themselves in, they exercised the freedom to do the right thing, regardless of the cost. That's the difference between liberty and freedom. And we need to understand that while governing authorities may take our liberty away, they cannot take our freedom away. We can always choose to do the right thing. And if there are consequences to that, then so be it. But we need to finally obey God. But short of that, we owe the governing authorities submission and honor. And we submit, we obey the laws of the land, Peter says, because there are ignorant and foolish men in power, and such men will slander Christianity. It was true in Peter's day. Understand that Peter is saying this under the just and benevolent rule of Nero, who was certainly a great statesman, man of goodwill for all the people. And so there were ignorant and foolish men in his day. There are ignorant and foolish men in power in our day. And they will slander Christians. And the way that we answer that slander is by our good behavior, by being good citizens, by obeying the law, and by putting the lie to their slander. And I would say, for our sake, this is a bit out of the bounds of what Peter has to say, but we need to understand that the answer to our problems is not going to be found in an election. We get really cranked up about that sometimes, and I'm not going to get political, don't worry. But the answer is not found in an election. We've been having elections for 200 years, and we haven't solved any problems yet. God is the answer. And God is on the throne. And God is on the throne regardless of which party's in power or who's doing what. God is on the throne. And that's where we need to take our confidence. And that's where we need to find our peace. And so we submit to the governing authorities, whoever they may be, to show them the glory of God. Okay? And then Peter says something really interesting. He says, act as free men and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil. In 21st century America, when we think about freedom, we often think in terms of liberty, and freedom means I can do what I want. And Peter says, no, it doesn't. That's, in fact, not what it means. What he is telling us when he tells us to act as free men is he's telling us to use the freedoms we have to glorify God. Use the freedoms we have to glorify God. Use the freedoms we have and the opportunities that are presented to us to live in ways and behave in ways that glorify God, that men may see our good works and glorify our Father in heaven. And then he says, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. And so he gives us a law that surpasses human laws. There's a fascinating statement from the early 2nd century, the epistle of Mathetes to Diogenes. And here's what he says about Christians. He says they have a common table, but not a common bed. They are in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. They obey the prescribed laws, and at the same time surpass the laws by their lives. Now think about that last statement. They obey the prescribed laws and at the same time surpass the laws by their lives. And Peter is really telling us how to do that. And he starts out, he says, honor all people. Do you think, and I know the current mood in the culture is one of general peace and benevolence. That is, people seem to be getting along famously. And if you doubt that, just look on social media and you'll see all the benevolence and peace that exists on Facebook and Twitter and all those platforms. Do you think people might notice if in all our interactions we treated people with dignity and respect? Do you think that might stand out? It was interesting to me recently. I was involved in a Bible study with a young man from China. And he was fascinated by the fact that Jesus went and ate with sinners. And his comment was, no leader today would do that. Because we just look across the table at our enemies and hurl epithets at them. We don't sit down with them and talk to them and treat them like this. And he has zero background in the Bible. All of this is brand new to him. And he sees Jesus behaving this way and says, this is really different. And he said that because that's really different. And what if we acted that way? And I'm not suggesting that we agree with people who are promoting wickedness and evil. What I am suggesting is we treat people as if they're created in the image of God, no matter how far from that state they may have fallen. That we treat them with dignity and respect, and if we're going to disagree with them, and certainly we should if they're promoting evil, that we disagree with them with dignity and respect. We conduct ourselves honorably. I think people might notice that. In fact, I'm absolutely sure they will, because it's not all that common. And so he says, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. And so, again, who's the king? The Romans never would have referred to him that way. Who's the king? It's Nero. Honor Nero? Are you serious, Peter? Honor Nero? Well, yeah. In the sense that you treat him with the dignity that his office holds. Again, it doesn't mean you agree with him about everything. It doesn't mean you like everything he does. But our political interactions are an opportunity to send a message. And it's pretty polarized right now. I think this is a really great opportunity. It's not the bar. The bar for civility is not that high. And we need to remember that when we're involved in interactions, whether they're actual or virtual. And we need to conduct those interactions in a way that brings glory to our God and Father in heaven. And then Peter goes on to talk about work. And he says, servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. For this finds favor if, for the sake of conscience toward God, a person bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. For what credit is there if when you sin you are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. And so he says, be submissive to your masters, and not only to those who are good and gentle, but to those who are unreasonable. And, we're probably at some point going to encounter someone at work who is in fact unreasonable. And he says we need to behave in such a way that we don't respond in kind. And we're going to say more about the conflict aspect of this tomorrow evening. But we need to understand the work we do has very little to do with who we work for. Our boss doesn't define us. We don't get to say, oh, my boss makes me so angry. Well, your boss may in fact be unreasonable, as Peter suggests. He may be hard to deal with, as Peter suggests. But we got a choice about how we respond to that. And we can allow him to make us angry. But if we do that, he wins. Because he then gets to define us. And frankly, that's beneath us in our call as God's people. To allow the evil to triumph over good. And so we need to work heartily under the Lord. We need to be good employees. We need to be diligent. We need to be honest. We need to be gracious and kind. We don't need to allow our circumstances or the people around us to define who we are. We need to take ownership of who we are and be people that honor God. Because this finds favor if for the sake of conscience toward God, a person bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. And that happens. I'll say it again. I said it before, I'll say it again. There's no such thing as a secular job. This is spiritual work. This is spiritual work. We're glorifying God. And so, if our boss comes to us and asks us to do something wrong, then we don't say, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that. And if there's blowback from that, then there's blowback from that. But we've been provided an opportunity to glorify God, and we need to rejoice in that opportunity. And if that hurts our career, or even if we lose our job. We've got a good friend back home in Lexington. And years ago, he was working for somebody, and the guy came up and told him to lie to a client. And my friend turned around and looked his boss in the eye, and he said, look, I won't lie to you, and I won't lie for you. Well, his employment was severely shortened, let's say. And he's not the only one I know that has had an experience just like that. But he did not allow his boss or his economic concerns to take away his integrity. And so if we suffer unjustly, if we do the right thing and are punished for it because of our devotion to the Lord, then that finds favor with God. And there will be many occasions to do that. But Peter says something here that he says repeatedly, and it's really very important. He says, what credit is there if when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. And so make sure, if you're suffering at work and your boss is always on you, make sure it's not because you're not a very good employee. Make sure it's not because you're lazy. Make sure it's not because you can't be counted on to do what you say you're going to do. Don't let that happen, because that just brings shame on the name of the Lord. Make sure that you work as unto the Lord. That you are diligent and honest and faithful and gracious. so that there is no occasion on which the people you work with or the people you work for may justify bring an accusation against you. Because that can undo so much good. So Peter says, don't let that happen. Because we represent all the time. And I think we all recognize, before we move into family, I think we all recognize that this is critical. How many times have you heard somebody say, well, I go to church, but they're all hypocrites? Has anybody not heard that? Raise your hand if you haven't heard that. Okay. Oh, you haven't heard that. Good. You're most blessed of all men. So, that's not always true or fair, but it comes up as often as it does because there are many who claim to be something they're not. And we cannot do that in our political interactions, in our work interactions. And then Peter moves to marriage, and I realize I skipped something really, really important, and we're going to come back to that. But I want to talk about the family for just a moment. It says, in the same way, you wives be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives, as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior. Your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair and wearing gold jewelry and putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. For in this way the former times, the holy women also, who hoped in God, used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you have become her children, if you do what is right, without being frightened by any fear. I'll address the husbands in just a moment. But he talks about the purpose of submission here, and he says, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives. And so Peter envisions a range of situations here which would include a marriage between two Christians who are trying to do what's right, but would go as far as even a situation where the wife is serving the Lord and the husband is not. And he says powerful change can be affected by respectful behavior. And I want to, if you will, allow me a couple of stories to sort of illustrate what I think he's saying and how this works. So several years ago, when I was living in Mississippi, a good friend of mine called me up, and we were chatting, and he was telling me that he was going to get a new Macintosh computer. It was the 90s. Okay. He was going to get this new computer. He's pretty excited about it. He said, I just have to talk to my wife about it, and it'll be a done deal. And so several weeks went by, and I talked to him again. I said, did you get your new computer? And he said, no. I didn't get it. I said, what happened? Yeah, she killed it. She just killed it. And I knew his wife. She was a gracious, devoted wife. And so I'm really curious at this point. I said, well, what did she say to you? And he kind of paused. He said, I asked her about it, and she told me that she knew I would do what was best for the family. And so what did she do there? What she did? What she did was she trusted him. And said, you know what, I believe you're going to make a good decision on this. And then, poor guy had to make a good decision. the pressure was on, right? She didn't tell him no. She didn't lecture him about money. She just said, I trust you. Which it really had power. It brought out the best in him. And, we were kidding around a little bit. He didn't really regret that in any real sense. But that kind of respect and submission has the power to make people better. Another anecdote, if you will, there's, again, back in Mississippi, I had a mechanic named Lee, and every time, Lee was not a Christian, but his wife was. And every time I saw Lee, every time I'd go take my car in and get it fixed, Lee would look at me and say, "Old Valley, she's a pretty good old gal." That was his wife. And, I didn't really know the backstory of that, but he said that just relentlessly. "Old Valley, she's a pretty good old gal." And what I found out years later was early on in their marriage, she got up one Sunday morning and she got ready to go to worship the Lord. And as she's getting ready, Lee says to her, he says, "I don't want you taking the car this morning." And she said, "Okay. Okay." And so she finished getting ready and she headed out the door, and he chased her out the door, and he said, "What are you doing? I told you not to take the car." And she said, "I know, I'm walking to services." Well, they live 15 miles outside of town. And he looked at her. He said, "Get back in there and get the car keys." She went back in, she grabbed the car keys, and she went on to services, and she just quietly went about serving the Lord for about 40 years. And then some things happened in Lee's life. He lost a good friend, and he started thinking, the evangelist there at the time asked him, he'd been asked many times, but asked him to study, and he finally agreed. And one day, Valley came home, and he looked at her and he said, "I think I need to be baptized. What do you think?" And she looked at him and she said, "Well, I don't know. You're going to have to make that decision." She was not about to start telling him what to do at this point. And he did make that decision. He did. She brought her unbelieving husband to the Lord by her quiet, submissive faithfulness to him and to the Lord. And that had real power. And it changed him. And I'm convinced that's why every time, every time he saw somebody who knew his wife, he said, "Oh, well, she's a pretty good old guy." That was working on him all those years. Her quiet, diligent faithfulness broke his stubbornness. She was stronger than he was. And that's what Peter is telling us. This has real power. It's not about outward adornment. It's not about how someone looks. It's the hidden person of the heart. It's the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God and which has the power to transform the people who see that, who witness that. And I understand it doesn't always end well. It doesn't always turn out that way. But Peter is telling wives that they have the power to be a profound influence on their husbands through their submission. And then something very interesting happens in verse 7. And I want to give some attention to this. He says, you husbands, in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way, as with someone weaker, since she is a woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. And then all kinds of challenging aspects to this passage. One of the first questions that comes up is, what does he mean when he says, live with your wives in an understanding way as with someone weaker? Well, what does that mean? And you know, a lot of times the explanation I've heard many times about this text is, well, husbands need to understand their wives, and they need to know what they like, and know what they want, and know what the dress size is, and the favorite color, and the favorite restaurant, and all that stuff. And I suggest that's probably a pretty good idea, but that's not what Peter's talking about. Okay? I'm not suggesting you shouldn't know those things, but I don't think that's what this text is about. And then as with someone weak, and I've heard everything from, upper body strength to who knows what. I don't think that's Peter's concern either. So what does he mean? Well, this is the first time in this text, up to this point, he addressed citizens who are subject to governing authorities. They're in a position of submission. He addressed servants who are subject to their masters. He addressed wives who are subject to their husbands. And now, for the first time, he addresses someone who's on the other side of this, who's in a position of authority. And here is what I believe he is saying to us as husbands. He is saying, you need to live with your wives understanding that she is looking to you for spiritual leadership. And if you don't provide that spiritual leadership, if you don't fulfill that God-given need, you put her in a very difficult position, because she has been placed by God in a role of submission, and she is counting on you to lead. She is depending upon you to lead. And then he says, what I think is a little bit frightening. He says, show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, which tells us it's not about spiritual superiority and inferiority. Certainly not in the situation he envisions, where at the beginning, where the wife is in fact doing better spiritually than the husband. Certainly that's not the case. She's a fellow heir. She has equal value before God. It's not about spiritual weakness. But what he's saying to us as husbands, saying, look, your wife is depending upon you to provide spiritual leadership. She's looking to you for that. She needs you to do that. And if you don't do that, knowing that she depends upon you for that, and you don't provide that, then don't turn around and pray to me and say, look, God, I'm depending on you here, and expect me just to ignore the fact that you neglect those who are depending on you. And that's, frankly, kind of frightening, guys. If our wives come to us and they say, I wish we'd prayed more. That's our wife's humble, kind, submissive way of saying, you're not getting the job done here. I wish we'd read the Bible together more than we do. But, not getting the job done. We are responsible to present our wives before God holy and blameless. We're responsible for helping them to conform to the image of Christ. And I'm leaning on Ephesians 5. We've got a responsibility. And I want to lean on Ephesians 5 just a little bit more, because you may think, well, you've gone from talking about how we interact with the world to how we interact in our marriages, in our homes. But there's something bigger going on here. And it really comes out in Ephesians 5:32 when Paul talks about the relationship between the husband and the wife of Christ and the church. And then in 5:32 he says, but I'm speaking with reference to Christ and the church. What are you talking about, Paul? Are you talking about marriage? Are you talking about Christ and the church? I'm talking about Christ and the church. Nevertheless, this applies to marriage. What does that tell us? What does that tell us about marriage? What it tells us about marriage is that marriage is a picture of the gospel. Marriage is a picture of the relationship between God and His people. And that the world ought to be able to look at those of us who are married, and you don't have to be married to serve the Lord, certainly. But the Lord ought to be able to look at those of us who are married and see the redemptive love of God. See the purposes of God played out in real life and real time. And they ought to be drawn to that. And that's what the kind of relationship that Peter describes here in 1 Peter 3 and Paul describes in Ephesians 5, that will be the result of that. And that too is an increasingly rare occurrence in our culture today. The family is not in a good way. I think I'm stating the obvious. And at the center of all of this is Christ. In 1 Peter 2, 21 through 25, he says, you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example to follow in His steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in His mouth. Now, there are two things right off the bat that we see in the example of Jesus Christ that we need to bring to all of these things. And the first one is a willingness to suffer. The first one is a willingness to suffer. We've got to be willing to suffer the slings and arrows of the governing authorities. We've got to be able to willing to suffer the slings and arrows of our boss. We've got to be able to suffer for the good of our homes and our families. We've got to be deeply committed and willing to do it no matter how hard it is. And what is it we're doing? We're living our lives with deep devotion to the Lord, having no deceit found in our mouths. And when we're reviled, we don't revile in return. When suffering, we utter no threats, but we keep entrusting ourselves to Him who judges righteously, because that's what Jesus did. God, whatever injustice may be perpetrated on me, God's going to take care of it. God's going to fix it. That's what He did for the Lord. That's what He will do for us. And He says about Jesus, He Himself bore our sins in His body on the cross so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by His wounds you were healed. For you were continually straying like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. We have all enjoyed the redemptive purpose of Christ. We've all enjoyed the benefits of that. We've all been brought back to God through that. Our life, our day in, day out life, can in fact be lived in a way that is redemptive, that calls people to God. Our example matters profoundly. The way we conduct ourselves in political interactions, the way we conduct ourselves at work, the way we conduct ourselves in the home, all of those things can speak to those around us about who God is and what His purposes are for us and for them. That's how we proclaim the excellencies of Him who called us out of darkness into His marvelous light. If you're not a Christian, I want to go back to something that Peter said. He talked about proclaiming the excellencies of Him who called us out of darkness. And that's where we all were. And if you're not a Christian, that's where you are. You are in the dark. You are without God and without hope. This world's a dark place. It really is. But we don't want that. We want you to be reconciled to God. We want you to share our hope. We want you to know the love of God in Christ Jesus that passes understanding. And so we call you to God through Jesus Christ. If you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and you are willing to confess Him as Lord, to yield absolutely to Him, turning away from the things that have separated you from God, repent of those things, and be baptized, then you can share our hope. So we call you to God through Jesus Christ tonight. If you need to obey the gospel, please come. And if you're struggling with the world, and you've gotten beaten up, beaten down, let somebody know. Let us help. Together, by the grace of God, we can make a difference to the people around us. If you need to come now as we stand and as we sing.